This week, we welcome Matt Cauthorn, Vice President of Sales Engineering at ExtraHop, to discuss Sunburst. Everyone missed it, or did they? In the Leadership and Communications section, cybersecurity failure among highest risks, warns World Economic Forum. How to reboot a broken or outdated security strategy, a 21st century solution to our cybersecurity skills shortfall, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Most breaches are caused by exploiting oversights in basic cybersecurity fundamentals, but complex hybrid multi-cloud infrastructures make cybersecurity hygiene challenging. Red Seal can help. It shows you what's on your network, how it's connected, and the associated risk across public cloud, private cloud, and physical environments. With Red Seal, you'll get control of your cybersecurity fundamentals so you can protect your organization from the inevitable attack vectors and reduce your cyber risk. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/Red Seal.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 203, recorded January 25th, 2021. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Colorado, a little snowy today. Joining me from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island is my first co-host, Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Hey, Matt, it's good to be here.
And joining us remotely on the lines is Mr. Jason Albuquerque, the author.
Hey, Matt. Hey, Paul. Great to be back.
So, guys, I have to ask you, how bad do you feel today that Brady's in the Super Bowl but not with the Patriots?
I cheered for Brady this entire time, my friend.
Not bad at all. I mean, I'm upset the Patriots aren't in the Super Bowl, but I'm happy for. I'm still a Brady fan. I mean, he played all those years for us.
He gave us 20 years, man.
What an amazing athlete, individual. I mean, it's unbelievable. 18% of Super Bowls have featured Tom Brady, something like that. Like, the stats are just amazing.
It's absolutely crazy. Amazing. Great leader. Yeah, we talk about leadership. Great leader.
Oh, yeah. And I was happy to see him go with a new team, to be able to take that talent and like instantly provide value into the Bucs.
It sounds like he runs the team. It's kind of I don't know if you watched some of the pregame.
Just a little bit.
But like, he runs the show over there. And I mean, why not? Obviously, he's doing a good job. They're going to the Super Bowl. So
I mean, if you listen to some of the post-conference ownership and the coach both tip their hat to Brady.
Yeah.
There you go.
What a leader. Do you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly? Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher, our YouTube channel, sign up for our mailing list, and join our Discord server. Also, if you missed Security Weekly Unlocked, you can now access all the content on demand, whether you registered before the live event or not, by visiting securityweekly.com/unlocked and clicking either the button to register or the button to log in. This segment is sponsored by ExtraHop. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. Matt Cauthorn is no stranger to the show. He's responsible for all security implementations and leads a team of technical security engineers who work directly with customers and prospects. Passionate technologist and evangelist, Matt is often on site with customers working to solve the complex and mission-critical business problems that Fortune 1000 and Global 2000 companies faced. After years spent helping customers tap into the value offered by network-based analytics, Matt has been able to bring fresh thinking to security threat detection. Matt, welcome back to Business Security Weekly.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Good to be back.
So we're going to talk about Sunburst. And we haven't talked about Sunburst on this show. I know, Paul, you've talked about it on a couple of the other podcasts. But I want to take it from kind of almost like a lessons learned. Like, what did we learn anything from this? And I want to start a little bit, Matt, with this concept of, why didn't we see this coming? What was missing, or did we see it and we just didn't know what it was? Why is this such a very interesting attack?
Well, to me, and I can speak for myself here and a little bit on behalf of the company. You know, one of the things that supply chain as an attack vector has been around for quite a while. In the last several years, we've seen several different supply chain attacks. This one happened to be extra nasty though, because it effectively just drop shipped malware into the east-west corridor next to critical server assets on systems that tend to be quite privileged to do their thing. It's very, very common for solutions like theirs to ask for elevated privileges, and therefore you're sort of bypassing a lot of the sort of early scaffolding of an attack campaign, and you're just dropping right into the environment with, network level access to many, many things. And you're locked and loaded in erstwhile it looks like it's official stuff, and it flies under the radar. They did quite a good job of sort of hiding in plain sight for many months, and here we are.
Yeah, I think I think what's interesting here is that our normal north-south detections kind of got bypassed, right? And if you're focused kind of on the north-south traffic flow, there was nothing really there to see, right? A lot of this was lateral movement based east-west traffic, and how many people are really have that kind of visibility in their environment to see that lateral movement.
Yeah, well, they designed with that in mind, obviously, because, so they drop into the east-west corridor, and then their command and control channels. There's a couple of different stages of C2, one via the DNS, the famous domain names that are all over the web now, and Blackhold by Microsoft. And then the secondary stage, which was happening over HTTP, and all of that, just to be honest, they did a really good job of sort of hiding in plain sight, if you will, right? It looked like, in fact, they went so far as to effectively replicate the sort of the traffic itself from the solution provider, from SolarWinds, and they did some C2 command and control gymnastics inside of various HTTP payloads and things like that. So it was really hard to identify without knowing what it was ahead of time. And so there was really two main detection vectors here. One is that post-compromise, one is the initial C2, which happens after the disclosure and after the announcement was made by FireEye. And then the secondary stuff that happens post-compromise and then the lateral corridor. That's where the sort of actions on objectives are being met. And that's where the behavioral analysis should really kick in our opinion.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, we know that this attack started a long time ago. I think the Microsoft article that came out last week, this was happening like September of last year when they did some of the initial tests around could they inject malicious code into the servers. Then they stopped for a period of time and they waited. And I think it was right around February when things started to move on the malicious front. Thinking about that timeline, February to, it was right before Christmas when kind of everything became public from FireEye. What did you guys see anything in the customer environments that would have clued people in that something's not quite right? I mean, was there anything that got detected during that time frame that looked suspicious?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's interesting you say that, because we recently, late last week, we dropped a 2-part blog post series by one of our chief data analysis folks. And we actually we saw 150%. Let me just get the months right here. So between March and October, we saw 150% increase of behavioral anomalies where we're in the east-west corridor, the server-to-server corridor, the lateral movement corridor, unfortunately. So we did see a very material increase. And then the subsequent decline after the disclosure and all of the sort of remediation effort kicked in. So unfortunately, we did see a pretty material increase in our behavioral analytics and the detections that came from it.
I think there's a kind of an age-old problem where you inherently trust what's on the inside of your network. Yeah. I mean, this goes back 20 plus years ago. I think I can say it now, right? There was, since, so much time has passed, one of the passwords was like capital B baseball, right? And everyone knew it. And everyone's like, well, it's okay. We're behind the firewall. And I'm like, but so like what happens if someone's on the inside of the network now and they happen to discover this password, which by the way, back then was being transmitted over Telnet. So I'm like, now like what happens? There's no internal controls here. Yeah. But everyone you had that like comfort, like a safety blanket of, but we're protected. somehow because we're on the inside of the network. And I think that translates today into, Matt, both Matts were describing that kind of situation, right? Where it's a trusted process, it runs on all our internal systems, and you're like, well, I feel comfort that there's protections in place, and so I'm comfortable. But you shouldn't be comfortable at all.
It's not a threat model or I should say it is part of your threat modeling that's easy to sort of sweep under the rug because frankly, supply chain is just a really hard problem to solve.
Yeah.
And I think that in this case, it's not super evident how easily they were able to gain access, but it looks like they got in pretty easily to the supply chain itself, which is super unfortunate. But yeah, you're basically in many situations, you're basically inheriting whatever technical controls the vendor has in place, and you're just taking it on faith in many cases. And the argument there, as a network detection solution, right, and response, we have people pretty frequently asking us to suppress detections, behavioral anomaly detections on, can solution A, B, or C because it's sanctioned to be okay in the environment. And we always discourage that suppression actually for reasons exactly like this. Yeah. So your point stands, Paul, 100%.
I also think the second thing, just hearing this kind of description of the attack, which is awesome, is looking at outbound communications, looking for that C2 communications, and just how difficult that is. Well, one, I think it's not everyone is looking in the right ways, and two, just how difficult that is. John Strand and I spent a lot of time thinking about how we would detect that C2 that goes from the inside of your network out. And, as penetration testers, we're like, oh, but we can get around it this way. And then we do a little design, and then we're like, oh, okay, we can catch that. And then like other people on the red team would come up and be like, oh, we need to take care of that. But it's like constantly this cat and mouse game. And I'm sure you guys see that at scale at ExtraHop. And scale is what makes that problem exponentially more difficult when you've just got so much outbound communication from so many systems.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but I think the malactors went out and purchased recently deactivated domains to actually do this. So I sit back and I wonder, would reputation tests on the domain actually be valid?
Yeah,
right?
I agree, but it's more about looking at that traffic and those patterns and detecting patterns rather than a signature of like
than a reputation.
Domain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the characteristics, and I'm not a deep authority on but I've read enough on Sunburst to be able to speak to this a little bit, at least. One of the characteristics is in the sort of primary and secondary C2 stages, they were really, really innovative, and they did a great job of hiding themselves. They got that domain via a proxy registrar, so attribution got even more difficult. And if you go in the Wayback Machine, you see that it goes way back. As you would imagine, there's just a robots.txt file sitting there. So the thing wasn't on any list, and it was just ripe for the picking and sort of obfuscated as to who bought it and how they, where it ultimately landed through the proxy registrar. And this is exactly why we take a hybrid approach to network-based detection. One is based on threat intelligence and based on rules, very like you would think an IDS or a next-gen firewall would be capable of, because that stuff matters. Threat intelligence matters. When a big disclosure like this lands, you want the info to be running, and you want to look for those indicators immediately. Fair. Well, we also take the behavioral analysis approach with ML, and the reason why that is because, well, we've already established we saw a 150% increase in behavioral anomalies in the east-west corridor. And so when the 0 days drop, you've got the sort of disclosure-dependent detection vector. And Paul, this speaks to your problem exactly. It's like it's really, really hard to do some of this proactively. And you really have to rely on behavioral analysis to catch this stuff. Then when the disclosure lands, you want to be able to sort of honor the rules and the TI that you've built your practice around. And so that's why we take a hybrid approach to this stuff from the perspective of the network.
Yeah, and it also, Matt, to your point, and I think it also an endorsement, for ExtraHop, is machine learning is totally applicable here. Like, I know we throw these terms around and we think they're buzzwords, but if you're trying to detect proactively the C2 communications, you absolutely need some type of machine learning. It's actually a really good use case for certain types, certainly, of machine learning.
100%. Yeah, like nowadays, I think that for the CISOs that we're talking to, like honestly, machine learning is just table stakes at this point.
Yeah, agreed.
At this point, we've gone through the sort of hype cycle and the trough of disillusionment, and now we're squarely in the sort of pragmatism of machine learning, because there's so much data that a practice can benefit from, but there's just not enough humanoids to throw at the problem, and machines happen to be really, really good at that stuff. So boom, machine learning is now table stakes, or it should be for the practice, in our opinion.
But Matt, you said something very interesting, and some folks I've been talking to, very smart people, also agree that in cybersecurity, we've got a lot of data. And we sometimes look at that as a negative, but when it comes to machine learning and data science, having a lot of data is a really good thing, right? I mean, provided you have the right data and the right methods for looking at it. But when we, obviously we're still in this global pandemic, and sometimes we ask questions, as I mentioned before the show, my wife's in healthcare, and we ask questions, and I'm like, I bet you we don't have enough data to answer that question. And then I ask friends who have backgrounds in epidemiology, and they're like, actually, you're right, we don't have enough data to say anything conclusively. And I'm like, but wait, let's transfer these problems to cybersecurity. We've got a heck of a lot of data to go through, and that's a good thing because we can apply some smart machine learning to it.
Yeah, and to Matt's point, not enough humans. So we need that. We need that level of automation. We need that level of machine learning and the machines to actually do it for us, because we don't have enough people.
Yeah, just by way of like some tactical advice, to the extent that this is useful, we've been playing in this domain for over 10 years now, and it's very, very useful for the security operations folks and the executives in the security practice to think about their data and partition it along the boundaries of the source of the data. For example, endpoint as a data source, it's awesome. Everyone should be benefiting from that source of information. Same with logs for your SIM, and same with the network. And then lastly, there's a fourth category. I used to say there was a triad. There's really four with threat intelligence. Because right. So
but
Paul's enchanted quadrant.
My enchanted quadrants, which you described exactly, and ExtraHop, Matt, to your point, I sometimes get pushback on having the fourth quadrant there, threat intelligence. But I think people are like yourselves and others are really come around and being proponents of that, because you need that other source of information. Again, it's more data. Provided you can do the useful things with it, you can get useful results.
Yeah, you were right all along, 100%. In fact, I was guilty of that. I thought, threat intel was this sort of, it was this sort of dangling Chad, and maybe related enough to other areas, but it's a formal first-class source of data, in my opinion, at this point, especially now. We don't need any more evidence than Sunburst for that.
Right. Well, yeah, because putting the story together, having all these different perspectives and pieces strengthens your case. And that's a great thing for machine learning, right? Anytime you can adjust the score by pulling from a reliable source, that leads you to discovering, in our case, the anomaly, things like Sunburst. I don't know. Now this is a good question, did people detect the C2 communications using these methods, or is it mostly people going back because the attackers were so crafty?
So now another thing that we can take away from this experience, frankly, is the power of look back. If you think about the network analysis space just in general, for many, many years, outside of like the continuous packet capture folks, which have a whole other sort of technical problem that they try to solve, like how do you get low friction access to those insights in the packets, right? Because they're primarily focused on how to store it on disk and then index it for retrieval, right? So, but putting that aside, if you think about like traditional in IDS, IPS, and firewall and NetFlow, like those are discrete events that tend to be not, they don't tend to be stored long enough for retroactive analysis. A and B, they tend to not have enough transactional information to give you context you need to understand what the heck happened with something like Sunburst, which is really interesting. We have a GitHub repo out there, and we put a set of tools out as soon as the indicators landed, so customers could query the system and go back in. We actually logged the transactions on the wire. And so they were retroactively asking questions. It was like this interesting hybrid between IR threat hunting and just straight up detection. Like, do I have these indicators in my environment going back a couple of months? Yes or no? And unfortunately, for most of them, or many, there was a lot of yeses there.
But now for the folks jumping up and down going, well, but NetFlow is enough. NetFlow is enough. I want to go back to something you said earlier. ExtraHop. I'll call you ExtraHop, Matt, because I don't want people to get confused. But you said the attackers made the C2 communications look as close to the Sunburst, the SolarWinds traffic as possible. So your NetFlow is going to say, oh, you're going to look at that and go, well, that's, it's round and it bounces, so therefore it's a ball, and that's cool, right? But like what's inside of it is going to tell you, wait a minute, that's not SolarWinds traffic, that's something else. And in the look back kind of train of conversation we're on now, that's super important. I can look back to my NetFlow logs and go, I don't know, like that could be SolarWinds, it could not be, I don't know. It's the right ports, it's, maybe the right directions and all the right amount of traffic, all that stuff, but what's inside those packets is going to tell you whether or not.
100%. Yeah. You have to have layer 7, guys. Mm-hmm. In this day and age, you have to have layer 7. I think NetFlow is a useful data source, especially absent other network telemetry. But, if you just take, Paul, your example, you've got outbound HTTP, and it looks like it's going to IP addresses that AWS owns. Like, how much traffic does that match? And the answer is a lot.
Yeah.
And so now they've already they've gone right out from under your controls.
Yep.
And so without the layer 7 analysis, you're dead in the water.
Well, social media is the same way. And I'm not talking about how we talk about social media in the political context today, which is a whole different discussion. But one of my examples when we were looking for C2 traffic was pen testers and red teamers were like, well, I'm going to hide in traffic like Twitter and social media. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that's actually really brilliant. And to detect that, that's going to be a little tricky. I'm going to need, like you said, layer 7 to determine, like, is that something funny going on there in Twitter, or is that just someone tweeting or an application sending out regular tweets as a bot, right?
You guys, detection is really hard. Like, let's just be honest. It's as a class, and Paul, you brought it up. It's the sort of whack-a-mole. You've got this volleying, this perpetual cycle of volleying, and so for every new detection innovation, there will be some answer to evade that. And so it's this never-ending circle. This is where behavioral analysis really wins, because if you look at it through the right lens, you are your environment is your own best TI source. Mm-hmm. To the extent that you understand the behaviors there, you are your own best threat intelligence. And so why wouldn't you be the beneficiary of your own behavioral patterns and identify anomalies? And so we're back to MO.
Yeah. No,
From a CISO perspective, we're under a lot of pressure on our side, right? Because ultimately we have to get to these levels of outcomes to be able to make sure we're properly securing our organization. But guess what? We have to do it with the least amount of friction possible, because if we slow the business down, now all of a sudden we're getting kickback from the business, right? So for me, it's about choosing the right partners, the right tools, the right products to make sure you're getting this level of analysis while not causing a lot of friction on the business. It's a conversation that happens every single day with my customers, in my organization. How are we embedding security into our organization, but at the same time, not slowing the business down?
Yeah, I mean, if you take out like maybe car chases and a gunfight or two, it's like an action movie for the CISO every week. Like, I don't know how you guys do it. I mean, it's a very, very hard charter to strike that balance between the sort of obstructionist perception and in hindering the business and actually enabling the business with minimal risk at the same time. It's a really hard balance.
It's a daily conversation. It's daily lessons given to the executive team. It's daily conversations about risk versus reward. At the end of the day, you're absolutely right. It's not easy. But, we talk about it a lot on this show. As long as we're going to the business, providing the level of risk that's coming into the organization and having the right conversations, at least from my experience, once you educate the executives, they start to get it, right? And again, it's not going in there with all the technical jargon. It's going in there presenting risk to the organization. But again, our tools can't slow us down, because the second we slow the business down, that's when our juice starts to go away.
Absolutely.
Matt, hindsight's 2020 always, right? The indicators released by FireEye gave us a lot of retrospective look back to see what happened. Well, what do we learn from this? What are the things we have to think about going forward that puts us in a better position for the next attack that looks something like this? And it won't be exactly like this because it never will. But are there lessons learned from going through the analysis over the last, month and a half or so on recommendations on what customers should change or what they should be looking at or additional things they should be doing that would have given them a little more insight into potentially that this attack was going on in their network?
Yeah, we've covered off a couple of them already. Like one, look back matters for every single data source. Make sure you have retroactive analysis available to you, full stop. And think about your data in terms of the sources, network, endpoint, SIM, TI. And all of those things should be, there's going to be a little bit of overlap because in the world of security, you're signing up for some inefficiencies, right? You can't have this clear line of demarc. In fact, I would argue you don't want it. A clear line of demarc between each one of those data sources, but they should all be very complementary to one another based on where they're coming from, like an endpoint or the wire or logs or threat intel, the sort of power of the commons. And so these things, like to really think about your security tooling in a way that is complementary and strategic, where the Venn diagram of these tools and these overlapping areas they turn to be this sort of force multiplier as you move from behavioral analysis on the wire into, say, a runtime on a host. There should be like a thread of continuity there and leverage and context that you gain as you move. Typically, we see kind of a shotgun blast of tooling. You've got a disparate set of tools. They're not federated in any sort of operational way, and it gets to be really an exercise in swivel chair integration, if you will. It's kind of hard, and that in and of itself slows the practice down and increases friction and sabotages the charter of the SOC. And so look back for sure, think about your data sources correctly, like in terms of the sort of source of that data, and then how well your tooling complements the other data sources in the ecosystem, right? For us, network analysis really shined for Sunburst. For the next one, it might be an endpoint thing, or for the next one, it might be a SIM thing. And that's the point. That's why you want this sort of tooling coverage to give you like real strategic leverage, as opposed to like fingers crossed, check the box. I think I've got that covered. Those days are kind of gone now.
And I think the other thing you mentioned is behavior detections matter, because without the threat intel, without the indicators, boy, you would not have been able to put these things together into a rule set that worked, right? The behavior analysis and those behavior detections mattered in this case.
100%. Like one of the indicators was, scanning for open file shares. Well, that's a behavioral indicator. It's like, if I haven't seen Alderman's PC scanning the file shares in the network before, then I should probably surface that as an anomaly, because it is. And so you're exactly right. I appreciate you bringing that back up, because it's completely true. It's table stakes now. You really need it.
And Matt, the other thing that you said too, right? Which when this all came out, it made me realize quickly, I can't really trust my supply chain no matter what. Emphatically trust, right? So I think the whole don't put exceptions in that statement that you made earlier, because if Alderman's PC was an exception, then you would have never seen it anyway, right? So for me, it's, challenge the process, challenge it all day long. Your most trusted vendor could still be a threat vector.
100%. Depending on your threat model, you're completely right. If it's something that's internal to the east-west corridor, running with privilege, and it can see stuff, you definitely want to think about coverage, regardless of the vendor, 100%.
Yeah, and I think that's the other big challenge for some organizations is, covering their entire network landscape. Do they have the right resources and storage and all the things that you need to be able to do that effectively? But to your point, if you exclude anything or you don't monitor all that traffic, you're going to miss stuff like this.
Yeah. And actually, I have one more bit of advice there. Is like, if that sort of global coverage from the network's perspective is problematic, and it often is, it's often impractical to cover everything. Then focus on the critical assets, the target assets in the data center or the VPC or wherever you've got your stuff. Because then you're going to see accesses into those environments without having to, say, instrument Alderman's PCs. Sorry to pick on you, Matt, but instead of having to instrument your individual asset, I could instrument the target assets that you're likely to attack. And there you get a much, much better sort of set of leverage on your coverage model from the perspective of the network.
Yeah. One last question. What about the response side? Any lessons learned on how to better handle like response, especially to these behavior detections? Any lessons learned out of there? Because I think that's the other thing is, yeah, you see them, but what do I do with them? Is there better ways to handle these behavior detections in kind of your IR processes that put you in a better position to at least kind of do the investigation, dig in, look at the forensics, maybe do some look back? Any lessons learned on the response side?
Yeah, 100%. It's not enough to just stop at a detection. A lot of folks in the space will say, hey, we detected something that looks fishy. Okay, now good luck and tell us what you find. Well, without having historical, like actual layer 7 transactional data to back up your assertions or to back up the ML models and why you've come to the conclusion you've come to, and then being able to broaden that aperture out and understand like, well, you know what? I've not seen this guy issue these RPC calls before to the domain controller. That's super fishy. Or I've never seen this guy like floating a golden ticket around the network. Well, guess what? Now you do. And so without having that and that supporting evidence, I feel like a lot of the folks in the space have left customers short. I say this being formerly from ops myself, where it's like left to an exercise to the recipient of the analyst to figure out why any given thing fired. Well, it's really, really useful to be able to get that broader context around the detection, the assets involved, and the transactions that actually surfaced it, as well as the participants.
All very great points. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It was great to see you guys again.
Thanks,
Good
Matt.
seeing you as well. To learn more about ExtraHop's network detection and response capabilities, please visit securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.